Okay, so I'd like to welcome everyone to the JCCV Forum, Child Protection and COVID-19. The JCCV has an ongoing commitment to child safety in response to disclosures of institutional abuse by many survivors of the Jewish community. This momentum continued with the subsequent Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. The JCCV has conducted many educational forums assisting Jewish organisations with the development of child protection policies, and I would like to remember the positive impact of the late Anton Herman in pursuing this process. We work in conjunction with government bodies, constantly updating the Jewish community on changes to legislation and best practice standards. The JCCV recognises, as with you all, that the landscape has changed, particularly for the vulnerable in the community during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have been actively consulting with professionals, including Michelle Meyer, to guide us in all our responses to advocating for child safety during this pandemic. The JCCV is committed to educating professionals and the broader community, which has led to the development of these online sessions. So I'd like to now introduce our speakers and the moderator. Firstly, Emily Sanders. Hello. Emily is...
Hello there.
Hi. Emily is the Director of Regulation at the Commission for Children and Young People, looking after the administration of the Reportable Conduct Scheme and Child Safety Safe Standards. She has a background in law and has previous experience working at regulators, including the Environment Protection Authority and Victorian Commission for Gambling and Liquor Regulation. She also has policy experience in law enforcement and youth justice. Emily has played an active role in the Jewish community, delivering several forums for the JCCV on the Child Safe Standards and Reportable Conduct Scheme. She has also assisted the community in their response to the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. Emily was instrumental in articulating the recently formed Child Protection Communities of Practice in the Jewish community. This community of practice spans across professionals and other nominees with a commitment to child safety in the Jewish community. The goal of the committee is to promote best practice, education and learning opportunities in child safety practices across the Jewish community, which the JCCV also shares its interest. So welcome to Emily. Michelle Meyer has an extensive career working with survivors of child sexual abuse and their families in sexual assault crimes. Michelle has also pursued her interest in restorative practices as a response to child sexual abuse and completed her PhD back in 2008 on this topic. She is a restorative engagement facilitator for the Commonwealth Ombudsman and for the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services Redress Scheme. Michelle worked for 15 years in the Children's Court of Victoria and in a mediation role. She has worked for 20 years in the Federal Circuit Court as a family report writer. Michelle is also a child consultant with Victoria Legal Aid and a particular interest in child-focused family mediation, I should say. Over the last 5 years, Michelle has been the CEO of SEDEC, engaged in advocacy, support and delivering education forums to support survivors of sexual abuse in our Jewish community. Michelle is a founding member of the Child Safety Communities of Practice in the Jewish community. So welcome, Michelle, very much. Rahi Averbuk, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, close. Raki is passionate about child safety, an experienced policy professional who values a collaborative approach, working with organisations to develop lasting attitudinal change. Her experience includes National Child Abuse Helpline Coordinator for ChildWise, lecturer in the School of Social Work at Monash University, manager of the Child Protection Policy Service at SEDEC, and she has recently been the Safeguarding Children and Young People Manager for a large national sporting body. Raki is also a founding member of the Child Safety Communities of Practice in the Jewish community. So we have an amazing line of speakers. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone, and Raki to moderate the session if you can move forward with that now. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy, for that very kind introduction, and welcome everybody. Before we begin, I'd like to do a welcome to country, if I may. So we respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging leaders. I would also like to acknowledge that some people may feel uncomfortable given the sensitive nature of the content to which we will be discussing today, and we will provide a list of resources at the conclusion of this event should you need to seek additional support. So before we get straight into it, I know we don't have a very long time, so I'd love to get stuck into with our speakers. I just want to touch on some technical guidelines. We would like to request that everybody mute themselves, just to avoid any feedback while we are listening to our speakers today. And if you do have any questions, if you wouldn't mind please using the chat function at the bottom centre of your screen, and should we have enough time at the end, we will try and meet all those questions. So without further ado, I'd love to get stuck into it with you, Michelle, if I may. And really, I'd love to just focus straight away on the importance for Jewish cultural considerations in particular for our community to understand this in relation to responding to child sexual abuse. So what would you say are some of the key considerations, if I may?
Thank you, Raki, and thank you to my guest speakers. We have learnt a lot about the Jewish response to child sexual abuse, particularly with the advent of the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. And so some of these ideas and values have emerged from the Commission itself and from rabbis speaking out publicly against some of the barriers to how our people in authority have responded, members of the community have responded thus far. So the laws of Meyer, which is the concept of handing information on to authorities, there has been clearly a lot of public denouncements of that concept being used, that value being used when it comes to child sexual abuse. In fact, in Victoria, we are all obligated to report by law, and Meyer does not apply, and we should all be abiding by the law of the land. Of course, child safety is pikuach nefesh, saving of life. It is our religious obligation to report to authorities. Again, we've got many sources within the Torah, which is our framework for our values about not standing by idly by the blood of your neighbour. Of course, tzedek tirdof, we will always be pursuing justice, and tikkun olam, the concept of saving the world. So these are some important values that we need to be always mindful of and promoting. Even in times post-Royal Commission, I'm still hearing from people this concept of Meyer is still being proposed, used, discussed as a threat, as still a problem in our community, that concept is even still being discussed when it comes to child safety. So I just want to publicly state very strongly that, and rabbis have come out publicly against Syria in particular, and Losh and Horror, the concept of speaking badly of others. So I just want to then segue into the next idea that has really come up during COVID-19, because where we've been thrown into this pandemic, and really there's been a lot of concern raised about the safety and well-being of children during this time. And so I just wanted to have us to have a framework for understanding child safety during this time. Many parents are welcoming today as the first day back for all school children in Victoria. And that does not mean that we're fully in the stage of recovery from this pandemic. There are still many restrictions, and so we're not past this yet at all. So again, I just want to talk about some of the requirements that we should be thinking about right now. We know that there's been an increase in child abuse and family violence. Initially, the reports to police were lower than expected, but we're now seeing in police reports, police data to say that there is an influx of referrals for family violence, and we expect that there'll be an influx of referrals to child protection as well. We want to impress upon the community, and I expect today we'll have a variety of people attending this forum. Some will be professionals who do have more knowledge about this space. Others will be parents and other community members. So I am broadening the information to cover everybody. For some, this is just an important reminder and creating awareness about this topic as we're in this space now, and we always need to be reminded, and I think that's part of the role of community professionals in this area, is to constantly be reminding people about child safety. So we want to...
Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. Just wanted to continue with that key point. So specifically in relation to the community, what would you think is important for us to understand in relation to child protection, specifically at this time during a pandemic?
We need to be focused on understanding that child protection is everybody's responsibility. It's key to, as I was saying before, our values, but we are all responsible for keeping children safe. In fact, legislation requires that of us, but it's important that we have this conversation and members of the community spread that strong message that child protection is everybody's responsibility. In order to do that, we need to be aware of, say, signs of abuse, and if somebody does become aware of concerns, that they report those concerns. It's as simple as that. It's a simple message that we're all responsible, and we have a responsibility, if we do have concerns, to report those. I know that for some adults, they are keeping in touch with children online, and they may not be seeing them directly. As I said, with the starting of children going back to school, we may see children visibly, but we still may not. You know, parents may still be keeping their children at home after school and the like. So for some adults who do have that relationship with children, that they don't have enough to report, but they're still concerned. We're encouraging adults to maintain relationships with children online if they can, or in other ways, so that children have that network of safety, of adults in their safety network that they can turn to. Emily will be talking more about the online safety risks and the like, but we and other risks, but we certainly have been drawing the community's attention because children have been spending a lot more time online, and they're more likely to be exposed to cyberbullying, to porn, contact with strangers and grooming, and more likely to be having more contact with each other, and likely to be an increase in behaviours such as sexting. So anyone can consult at any time, and I'll give you some resources at the end for those agencies that you can consult with.
You make a really valid point about the need for us as a community to be the eyes and ears in any way or format that is available to us at this time, and that may mean via a digital space. Obviously, there are some key risk factors there that I understand Emily will touch on shortly. But in response to the community, what are key indicators of abuse that the community need to be aware of?
These indicators are not new ones, and I emphasise that these are almost like a checklist that everybody should have in their mind when post-pandemic, but I still draw our attention to them and repeat them over and over and over again, because we need refreshers and we need to recharge our thinking about this and be reminded. So when we're thinking about physical abuse, the obvious ones are key markers like bruising, bloodshot eyes, injuries inconsistent with the explanation for those injuries. We may not see those some of those necessarily, but it's important just to have some of these in one's mind, because one never knows when one's going to come in contact with a situation and think, oh, this doesn't add up, or I'm really concerned with that bruising. It just doesn't seem like it's consistent with the explanation that's been offered. So that's really important. With sexual abuse, there are a range of indicators, and one can go online and Google them more. I've really given a brief list here today, but some of the really important markers are changes in a child's knowledge, sexual knowledge, significant changes in one's behaviour from where one knew that child being at another stage in their lives. But the most important one is a disclosure of abuse, a disclosure of sexual abuse. When we're doing our work in schools, we encourage children to have a safety network. We don't know if we're on a child safety network, so we have to be prepared, and I'll go into this in a little while, that we may receive a disclosure from a child because they trust us and we're on their safety network. A child may have tried to disclose to multiple people in their network, and we might be on that list, so we have to be prepared that a child may disclose to us. A child may not disclose directly. They may just show indicators such as sexualized behaviours and other such behaviours that are indicators, and a child's way of disclosing might be through artwork, through play, we might see sexualized themes that way too. Some of the other indicators of abuse are emotional abuse. During this time, people may have seen children online in an online classroom setting where a child is constantly missing in the classroom setting, that they're appearing more socially isolated, that they're just not functioning at the level that they were before. They're more on edge, agitated. This is a very strange environment, and we can't always say that one indicator is an indicator. It will be usually behaviours in clusters, but I'm just drawing your attention to some of the general indicators again. And neglect issues, again, we may not see all of this online, but still worth mentioning. As I said before, children missing online classes repeatedly, wearing inappropriate clothes, that they look like they're constantly hungry, tired, suffering from illness. These are, again, just some general indicators to keep in mind.
Thanks for that, Michelle. I think we're quite aware that there has been an increase in child disclosures of abuse during this time. So how would one respond if a child does disclose abuse? to an adult within the community?
We have this acronym, the HEART principle, which is easy to keep in one's head, especially when we're talking about how we support a child with our hearts. So there are a number of principles that we encourage adults to be thinking about. If a child discloses in words, the first thing is that we say that we believe them. We try and remain calm, don't react with a sign of being shocked or disgusted, and we have to think that a child may be disclosing about another family member. So we have to just, that would probably be one of the hardest things we would ever hear in our lives, but we have to, for the child, try and remain as calm as possible. The next response is to empathise with the child, to give them your full attention. Don't put words into their mouth, just let them tell you at the level that they can and want to, and just empathise with them with messages such as, I'm really sorry that this has happened to you. Adult survivors have said to me how important those first responses were in them being able to pursue counselling and engage with police and the like, just to have affirmation and empathy in that first response is extremely powerful, and it's really helpful to hear that from adults who have been through this experience. Affirming that it's not their fault. I think, again, adults have said this to me when they're blamed or they're just, they don't get that response in the first place, this empathic response in the first place, they're more likely to retract. So we have to be very mindful that this is first response can be the most important time when a child discloses, is to obviously say that it's not their fault, and offer, you can never make promises. Children will say, please don't tell so-and-so. There's often threats associated with abuse, so we have to be hear those concerns, but it's really important not to promise that you will be able to particularly keep this a secret. The words we suggest is that I'm really glad you've told me, and I'm here and I will help us get some help for you, but I can't deal with this by myself, and I have to as an adult, I have to get some help for you. So that's a really important message that we convey to children.
Michelle, on that note, I think it's important to acknowledge that there has been a number of studies done in this space with survivors of sexual abuse, and often a recurring comment and theme that comes up is that survivors mention that they were looking for an adult to step in and to take away the pain and to stop the abuse. So even though they make those remarks about please keep it a secret, obviously out of fear in many occasions, it is important to note that just because they're saying that, that potentially could be the fear speaking, ultimately they are looking for an adult to step in and to intervene. Yeah,
and I hear that, and again, I hear that from adult survivors too, Raki, is that children too don't understand the complexity of this, and yes, fear does often consume them in that first instance, and we know that fear is often the barrier to children disclosing. Within other contexts of, say, institutional abuse, we know on average it takes 22 years for a survivor to disclose sexual abuse because of the fear, the threats that they've tried to tell somebody in the past and they haven't been heard. So when we have that opportunity to respond, we really do need to be offering that child to get them that help. If possible, record what the child says. I know you're probably going to be trembling and just feeling totally overwhelmed by a disclosure, but if possible, it's not an opportunity to take copious notes and interview the child. It's more just to take some, write some notes down about what the child has said, and yeah, just to keep that, because that could be very helpful further down the track. And then say to the child, and some say even to have the child with you whilst you make that report, others, you know, depending on the child and the circumstances, but I think it's really important that report is made straight away, and that you try and help the child through that. You might be like a friendly advocate just to stay with the child, particularly if it's abuse within the family and the family haven't responded appropriately. You might be that friendly adult who will just be there for the child and take them through the process.
I think it's also good to note that it's not the responsibility of the adult to investigate further. So by simply receiving that disclosure and by then sharing that information with the relevant authorities, that's enough. That's where their role ends. Certainly supporting the young person is important, but they don't need to take it into their own hands to investigate that further. They should let the proper authorities do that.
That's a very good message for anybody who receives a disclosure, whether that be a member of the community, a staff personnel in an organisation. You know, we've got so many organisations within the community that have a range of opportunities to have contact with children. That it's a very important message, no matter where you sit in the line of connection with a child, that there's a specialist service to conduct that investigation, and one's job is purely to be there and support and affirm the child, what the child says, and help them to get the relevant support. I think it's also important, as I said before, when you receive a disclosure, yeah, look, as a professional, when I've received disclosures, I'm overwhelmed and often don't have a personal connection to that child, but it's still, when you hear a child telling you this information, it is very overwhelming, and it's really important that once everything is dealt with, that you too get some help. And the resources that I offer at the end are certainly avenues for you just to get some counselling and to debrief at the end of the process. When you've got the child the help they need, you get some help too.
Absolutely, some excellent advice there. Thank you, Michelle. I just wanted to flag that all questions should be written in the chat function of Zoom, and we will turn to those shortly at the conclusion of our speakers. So it's a good opportunity now for us to turn to Emily Saunders. We're very, very lucky to have her available to speak with us today. I thought it'd be great, Emily, if we could actually start by talking about some of the work that you've been doing within the Jewish community specifically, and then obviously we can turn to some more specific questions around what child-related institutions should be doing at the current time.
Look, thank you very much, and thanks Judy and Annette for providing this amazing opportunity together with Michelle to be able to talk about these issues at this point in time. I think now more than ever, really focusing in on our vulnerable children and young people, and working out what we, as we all say, as adults, should be doing to protect and support them. It's just so important at this time. So look, just in terms of work with the Jewish community, I guess my role at the Commission for Children and Young People is looking after the enforcement of the Child Safe Standards and the administration of the Reportable Conduct Scheme. So those two systems really do provide, I guess, support for organisations to know how to better prevent and respond to allegations of child abuse should they arise, and also an independent monitoring and oversight mechanism for the investigation of allegations of child abuse. So clearly working with the Jewish community on on supporting organisations to be able to comply with those requirements, but also at the end of the day to actually achieve that prevention of child abuse, which is what we're all trying to achieve. So I'm really absolutely rapt that I've been invited today, and also to a range of forums, including those organised by JCCV and Michelle and others, to be able to help the community understand, I guess, those dynamics of organisations. And that's really where the Commission comes in child abuse. We've heard so much from the Royal Commission, and before that the Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry, about the dynamics within organisations that are quite unique, and which we do need to understand in order to make those organisations safer and prevent the institutional abuse of children that we have seen in the past. So I guess with the pandemic coming in, things have really shifted for organisations. We've had a range of organisations that have unfortunately had to close down temporarily. We've had organisations shifting their offerings onto online service delivery. We've had families who have been isolated in their homes out of necessity for health reasons. So at the moment, the Commission is very much focusing in on how we can support organisations to move with those shifts in society and shifts in organisations to prevent child abuse.
Thank you for that, Emily. I think what is probably most interesting at this point is to consider what child-related institutions should be doing currently during COVID-19, given that obviously circumstances have changed. You did raise the point that there are, of course, organisations that potentially have been stood down or shut down during this time. I'm wondering, as a side note to this first question, whether we could also touch on what we need to consider for those organisations who have been supporting children and young people who are no longer available at the current time.
Yes, good question. And I think the shutdowns have hit a range of organisations. So whether it's faith-based organisations, sporting clubs, you name it, even schools have had to stop physical meetings and move to different service delivery. So we've seen organisations, and I've seen a number of faith-based organisations reaching out to their communities, whether it's through social media, through Facebook, and those types of medium, but also then holding, as we're doing today, meetings online. We're starting to introduce video conferencing into our arsenal for ways to communicate. And so some organisations have kept alive in that way and have been very focused on how they support their community members. Others have stopped. And so what you see for children and young people then is that they have, in some circumstances, actually become increasingly isolated. What we've seen in the media is a very big focus on schools and how schooling is being delivered remotely now. And obviously now we're in the, today, I think the second batch of young people are able to get back into attending physical school. Other children and young people will probably remain at home for a period of time, either due to health reasons or vulnerability. So those organisations that normally are there for children and young people, Michelle gave a really good list of those sort of signs of abuse. Those signs of abuse are things that teachers, sporting coaches, those working in faith-based organisations are usually keeping an eye out for, as another set of eyes who's keeping an eye on a child or young person. And so without those organisations offering services now, some children and young people unfortunately have been cut off from the help that they so sorely need. So one thing that we are asking organisations is, if you have been closed, you're reopening, you're starting to engage with children and young people and their families again, just please keep a special eye out for children at the moment. If you're starting to see them coming back and you're noticing that things may not have been good whilst they've been isolated, please have a think about whether you might need to report something to Child Protection or police. Connect them with services, work out how you can offer them help at this point in time, because they really, really need it now. We're going to start to see children increasing in numbers in their vulnerability with job losses that have already happened and the economic situation worsening. So that unfortunately can have an impact on the safety of children, and we know that unfortunately from past experiences. If you have changed your service offering, you need to have a think about whether you need to update your risk management strategies in respect of child abuse. And that's a very, very important message that we're giving to organisations now. Now, it may be that you have moved online and that's the first time you've offered those services online. If that's the case, you need to make sure that you've identified the risks of child abuse and that you've got some plans in place to manage those risks.
Absolutely, and I imagine that you're likely to see an increase in risk factors with regard to professionals and the like having access to vulnerable children via technology. Certainly, in relation to organisations that have had that contact in the past, that would be a significant concern for their risk factors in, I suppose, developing their child protection policy to begin with. So there may be organisations out there that are not aware of the need to amend their policies. And likewise, there may be organisations who potentially haven't developed their strategies for child safety in a thorough manner, or even in relation simply to some of the changes that are emerging during this time. So I suppose from your perspective, what assistance is currently available to assist institutions in particular in reviewing their policies?
Very good point, and the Commission has popped out some information on its website, which I'll share the links with this group later on, just to prompt organisations to undertake that task of reviewing policies and procedures. So some of the things that organisations need to look out for are there increased opportunities for unwanted or unsupervised contact with children? Are there increased opportunities for grooming of children and young people? We've already noted the potential growth in cyberbullying and trolling that can occur. There's a risk of exposure to inappropriate or illicit or explicit content or imagery that can happen when you're suddenly in a video setting with other people. Those sorts of matters, in addition to things like potential breaches of privacy or sharing personal information that can happen, means that you need to look specifically at the online space and what you need to do. The E-Safety Commissioner, which is a federal body that supports all states and territories with how to be safe online, has got an amazing amount of resources out at the moment, and indeed they conduct their own webinars to help you understand online safety. Something specific though to organisations around child safe standards that I would ask organisations to think about is, how are you supervising your staff when they're online with children and young people? Now, you need to look at things like ensuring that your staff perhaps are only engaging with children and young people using official social media accounts of the organisation. Maybe you're setting up arrangements so that if you're engaging with a child or a young person over video, that their children are going to be there with you when you're doing that, or else that you've got a manager there with you in some way, that you've perhaps got two adults from the organisation in the conversation with a child or a young person. All of these sorts of different ways at the end of the day are aimed at ensuring that there's supervision of adults, that there's transparency of what adults are doing with children and young people in organisations. And in that way, it's another important mechanism to try and prevent child abuse from happening. Something else that's really quite important is to look at your code of conduct as an organisation. Make sure that that code of conduct covers behaviour with children and young people in online spaces. Make sure it's specific in that regard, and that you're very clear with the adults who are volunteers or workers in your organisation about how they need to behave with children and young people. Those are some of the matters.
I think it's some excellent points there. Thank you, Emily. But I think it's also relevant to consider the risk of peer-to-peer abuse increasing at this time as well. I know that many organisations fail to acknowledge the potential risk factors in relation to young people amongst themselves, but obviously it's changed into a somewhat different nature given the lack of face-to-face access at the current time. Do you have any advice in relation to that for us?
I think educating children and young people about online safety and risks of bullying and trolling and how to respond is absolutely the way to go. Things like, have you given a clear pathway to children and young people about who they can raise concerns with when there's something going wrong for them? Do they know when you're not physically in the room with them anymore and they don't have access to that other trusted adult in the organisation? Do they know who they can raise their concerns with? I think there's again, there's a range of resources from the E-Safety Commissioner which provide very, very good advice in that regard. There's also age-appropriate material there that children and young people can access themselves, animations and the like, just to connect with them in a way that's very consistent with their experience online. But the point being is that there should be a discussion about these things. Children and young people should be in a conversation with their parents about online safety so that this is an open thing. It's not something that's happening behind closed doors, away from adults and away from supervisors within organisations.
Thank you very much. I'm mindful that we do have a few questions coming in, but just before we turn to the public forum, I would love to ask both you, Emily and Michelle, the same question, if I may, and just really wondering about what available supports and resources are available specifically to the community if someone does need to make a report or to seek advice.
We certainly within our community, in the Jewish community, have access to the broader services and to the Jewish specific services. So I've put some of those resources here on this slide. I think it's important to also state that that one's not going to get into trouble for consulting with an authority like the Department of Health and Human Services or the police. If you're not sure, ring them and get some advice, because often that advice can just guide you with how to pursue a matter further. Of course, there's CCYP, which is a Jewish-specific service embedded in the Centre Against Sexual Assault. So that's an excellent resource if you want some culturally specific advice. And again, there are other resources such as Orange Door, which has a range of services within the one under the one roof, which includes services for family violence, but also for some of the other issues that we've raised today, and that's through Jewish Care has its own Orange Door facility, or you can contact, there's one in Frankston, which is a bit out of the way for many, but if you want anonymity and don't want to go to a Jewish service, then that Orange Door facility is available for the community.
Look, I think Michelle's given a fantastic overview there of the resources that are available and how to report. I guess just a reminder that the reportable conduct scheme is still in operation at the moment. Now, what that means is that organisations that need to comply with the reportable conduct scheme, if the head of organisation becomes aware of an allegation of abuse by a worker or a volunteer in the organisation, then they must still report those through to the Commission, in addition to reporting to police and then potentially also child protection if it's in relation to those matters. If you're unsure, you're not sure if it is something that has to go to the Commission and you want to test that out, we're still operating our phone line. You can send us an email or you can give us a call if you're wanting to test if that's something that needs to come through to the Commission as well. But I just encourage you to access those resources that Michelle has mentioned, because ensuring that people are supported at this point in time when they're facing that kind of a situation, particularly if they're more isolated at home. I can't promote enough the need to get some counselling and support for yourselves if you're dealing with these matters. I know that I'm sure this is the same for your organisations. Being in your home and hearing about these matters instead of being in a workplace, it's a very different kettle of fish, and you really got to look out for yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you both. I know that we do have some questions from the forum, so perhaps we'll take the last 20 minutes or so to be able to address those. The first question that we have is in relation to mandatory reporting. The question is more specific though, in relation to how does one deal with the importance of management of trust in encouraging the survivor to participate in the report. Perhaps Michelle, you might like to respond to that first.
I think that's one of the biggest dilemmas that we have as professionals in having to report a matter to in this case, if it's mandatory reporting, to the Department of Health and Human Services, and maintaining the trust with that child whilst having to have engage in something that's a very hard process for a child to go through. It may interrupt their relationships with family members. The consequences of a report can be very significant for a child. I think it's important to acknowledge how hard this might be. It's not to paint a picture that's going to be, that all is going to be well. That, you know, I think it's important just to talk about some of the reality of what this means. But if you're able to be that person, that constant figure to help the child through the whole reporting process, I think children want transparency. They want honesty and they want transparency. And again, this is from my years of experience working in centres against sexual assault, is that's what children tell me. You know, I just want to know what's going on. I want to be told. I want to be empowered. And those are the key, I think, principles to building that trust with a child. The more we hide things from children, the less likely they are to trust us.
I think you touch on a really important point there, Michelle, in relation to empowerment. And often children who are experiencing abuse of any kind, really, that's the last thing that they're feeling. And so by the ability to encourage them to actively participate in the process, we're actually encouraging them to feel empowered for potentially the first time in a very long time in the current circumstances. So I think that's an excellent point. Emily, did you have anything further that you'd like to add?
Look, I think Michelle did a really, really fantastic job of answering that question, to be honest. So the only other thing I'd add, and I think you touched on it as well, is around empowerment. And I guess when you receive a disclosure from a young person, this is an opportunity to build trust. Trust is earned. And so what you do next matters. We also already said, don't promise what you can't deliver. And we know that these matters need to be reported to proper authorities. So you do need to be clear and transparent with that young person about that. But I guess how you respond and that empathy that Michelle was pointing to earlier is quite important. We also know that children want adults to be predictable and dependable in that sense. We should be behaving in a way that is clear and transparent. This is what's going to happen next, and then ensuring that that's exactly what happens. And that's one of the other ways you can build trust through this experience. So if you do need to say to a young person, look, I really need to make sure that person X in this organisation understands what you've told me, so that we can work out, you know, what action, what you need to take to keep you safe, then that's exactly what you should go and do. Being predictable and dependable as an adult, and your responses should be clear to them that that's what's going to happen, and that's that transparency action.
Thank you. I think also a valid point to make is that young people often report to themselves before they report to an adult when they have a concern. And so making sure that we're opening up those lines of communication for all young people who are having any kind of contact with our organisations is absolutely vital, so that a young person who potentially has received a disclosure can feel comfortable to reach out for adult support and not carry that themselves.
I think that's a very good point, and this gets down to how your organisation is making all people aware of what are the reporting pathways if you've got any kind of safety concerns. It might be the friend of a young person who's the one who actually puts up their hand and says, hey, I'm a little bit worried about something that's going on for my friend. So whether it's parents, community members, workers, volunteers, children and young people themselves, they all need to be aware about how to let someone know if something's going wrong for them.
Absolutely. Taking a slightly different turn now, we have a question in relation to the fact that many schools are now engaging in the use of different types of technology, including WhatsApp as a method of communication between staff and parents and students. What are both of your views, specifically in relation to this platform, but also obviously extending to a variety of other platforms that are currently being used by educators with young people?
Emily, do you want to?
I'll start with that one, sure. So look, I think Platforms are all very different and they have different security settings and privacy settings. And I think in choosing what the platforms are, it's very important that you have that really good understanding of all of that and that you're setting it up to enable proper security and proper privacy. For example, I know that there's been a lot of talk in the media about Zoom and how that can sometimes be vulnerable in specific circumstances. So there are some organisations who have made the decision, if we're talking about particular confidential things, we'll use one platform, but if we're talking about things that are not so confidential, we use a different platform. So I think there's got to be that very detailed thinking about what's the appropriate platform for what I'm doing. Having a think about what the handle or the email address or whatever it might be of the people who are engaging in it is, and whether that's easy to guess from an external perspective. So for example, using email as the example here, in creating email addresses for children and young people, are you ensuring that they are not something that could be easily guessed by somebody from outside the organisation who may seek to inappropriately make contact with a child within that organisation using that email address? So those are the sorts of things that you really got to think about quite specifically in your choice of platform. The other thing is also making it clear what the options are if somebody feels uncomfortable. So let's say you feel uncomfortable in engaging in a particular either social media or communication software. How else can you communicate so that you can avoid it if you are feeling unsafe? Again, I'd just encourage people to go to the eSafety Commissioner's website because they've got some very detailed advice in relation to these sorts of matters.
Raki, if I can add to that, we've certainly had conversations with organisations during this time, and I must shout out to the Australian Zionist Youth Council and some of the work that they have been doing during this time, because they've been maintaining online contact with, the youth movements have been maintaining online contact with children during this time, and some of the things that they've had to think about in managing the risks is ensuring that that two adults are part of any communication with children, such as a WhatsApp group, that two members are of that youth movement are on that WhatsApp group. So there's a level of monitoring and transparency, that parents are also made aware of any communication that's being had with children, that their consent is sometimes obtained if need be for some of these online facilities, and that parents are acutely aware of everything that's going on, and you know, some have devised consent forms just to make that information available to parents, and that parents actually consent to their children partaking in some of these online mediums. The other just minor things is when we're talking about children communicating with other children, is that we remind kids about some of their own safety issues, not sharing passwords, not having one-on-one contact with adults and the like, which we would have been discussing beforehand, but even more so now, some of the risks that the youth movement have been considering during this time and addressing through some of those considerations. And as Emily said before, redevising the code of conduct and thinking that through in a different way as to what are our expectations of, say, our young, this was in regards to youth movements, what is our expectation of our own youth leaders during this time in that online forum.
And I think it's also about recognising that there is a need for adults who are utilising technology to become quite tech savvy. I think that young people tend to be 10 steps ahead of us when it comes to actively engaging and utilising technology to our advantage, but now it's become a necessity. So I think we do need to make sure that we are referring to resources like the eSafety Commissioner that Emily has referred to, that has a variety of resources that are extremely relevant to this setting. but also knowing the capability of the technology that we're choosing to utilise. So, for example, WhatsApp was proposed as part of that question. WhatsApp has a number of different functions that potentially an organisation can secure and disable if they're engaging and utilising it as their chosen platform. I know that when it came to the homeschooling circumstances, that a lot of schools and educational institutions were thinking about the place that young people were engaging and utilising Zoom, for example, and often encouraging young people where possible to avoid utilising their own bedrooms, obviously for fear of, I suppose, accessing a very private space, but also to try not to encourage the potential for peer-to-peer abuse in an extremely vulnerable environment. Michelle, do you have anything else that you'd like to add to that?
I think, again, a lot of the work that schools now need to be doing, now that children are going back to school, is some of the work that we do with our young people, particularly in this upper primary, secondary context, about appropriate and respectful relationships with one another, and instilling an education program as part of school curriculum is particularly important post this crisis, to be supporting children to be more aware of some of the behaviours that may or may not be appropriate. Children don't always understand the complexities of some of these relationships, understanding the grooming process. There are a range of factors here, and I think now more than ever schools need to be introducing education programs into their schools to assist children being more aware and mindful, and knowing how to respond if some behaviours, if they've got concerns and they want to know how to deal with those. So it's empowering children yet again, but back in the school forum.
Thank you, Michelle. Emily, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Look, just to reiterate that point about needing to then engage with children and young people about these forums, which can be quite intimidating for some organisations, as we've said, where you feel like you know less than the young people around, say, social media or online forums. But you do have to tell them how to raise their hand if they're worried, and if that's what you need to do, and that's the minimum you need to do, just focus in on that, because they do need to still understand that there are adults there, and there are adults there who want to help them. If you're unsure about how to approach this whole online world and what it means, have a think about who you can reach out to in other organisations that you have a relationship with. Is there that person on the board of that other organisation that you know quite well who actually does have a thriving social media presence? Can you talk with them about what it all means to help you improve your literacy so that you can keep up and best support those children and young people?
Some very solid advice there. So I think I'll just start to wrap up, as we've only got 5 minutes to go. First of all, I'd love to thank both Michelle and Emily for taking the time to speak with us today. I know that there have been many comments already being posted about how relevant and valuable this session has been. So I know that this is a very necessary discussion that needs to continue, but raising the alert given the current circumstances is just absolutely crucial. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank you both. I have had a few requests already about making the slides available, and I know, Emily, you referred to providing some links as well, so perhaps we can arrange that at the JCCV end, so that everybody who has an interest in this topic, even if they weren't able to attend today, I do know it is being recorded, so perhaps we can make it available at a later time.
Can I just give a plug, Rachel, for something else that I wouldn't mind distributing with this? The Commission's, as I said, we've got a particular focus at the moment on the experience of children and young people impacted by COVID, and we've actually got a survey for children and young people. So I would love to circulate that to this group and ask that, if you feel comfortable, share it with the children and young people in your organisations so that they can tell us. What we're doing with that information from children and young people is we're using it to advocate with government and with service providers about what children and young people need right now. It's such a strange and for some people terrible time, and having that clear voice to government about what children and young people need is so important. So I'd be grateful if you could consider asking the young people in your lives to participate.
I think that is a remarkable idea, and given the fact that we are in touch with young people utilising technology, it seems only fitting that we encourage them to actively participate in having their voices captured yet again. So I think that it's a wonderful note for us to end our discussion today. I'd just like to reiterate our thanks again to both you, Emily and Michelle, for providing your expertise today, and thank you everybody for joining us. If you do have any additional questions, we are providing you a list of resources where you can seek additional guidance. Of course, you can always reach out to the CCYP and of course to Michelle Meyer as well. So thank you once again, and thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, I just want to thank everyone. I thought it was also an excellent session. I found it really interesting, and I think there were a lot of clear points there for everyone to take with them. So we'll make sure through ENUT that those slides are available
Thanks,
on
Judy.
the JCCV site.
I see Tamar is possibly still there from the Jewish Museum. We can catch up another time just to review
Sure.
how that went. I think it's a great opportunity. Unfortunately, the attendance wasn't as...
No, wasn't as good as we would have wanted, but the ones that were there would have got a lot out of it.
That's exactly right. And
Yeah.
I note that Tamar's still there because it's Jewish. The Jewish Museum
Yeah.
is also keen to do something. So we'll have a number of opportunities to spread this message.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That was excellent, Raki. You did a great job there.
Thanks, Michelle. It was wonderful to see who was able to attend today. I wonder whether children attending school for the first time all at once today may have been an interruption, as well as many people will be attending work and having a bit of freedom again. I know I certainly am. So
Good point. Good point.
thank you very much for the opportunity. Very much appreciated.
Okay,
Thank
thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.